and for the match to get underway, because we see their blitz ratings. Magnus Carlsen, at least the heavy favorite heading into the match.
And just like that, we're off. Magnus Carlsen has played 1b3 as the crowd cheers up here against Hans Niemann. Maybe Hikaru Nakamura playbook, we're going to see a full ready commencing on the board here with Hans taking the early light squared bishop approach. Solid stuff right now from both sides. Are you surprised to see a double Fianchetto approach now from Magnus?
Well, I don't know if Adibon is working with Magnus, but we know the B3 Cowboy has made chessable courses and has been perhaps the most vocal proponent of this B3 move on move one. So we see both bishops Fianchettoed for white. So instead of striking in the center with pawns, these bishops would like to do the heavy lifting. At some point, you will have to strike in the center. But Danny, as we look at the board, we look at the clock, it's Magnus playing a little bit more quickly. So Hans is just trying to figure out how to play the most accurate response after each and every turn.
Yeah, he's taking his time, doesn't want to be thrown off, perhaps by an opening he didn't prepare for. Is that an early sign that Magnus has surprised him and that he chose something that Hans wasn't ready for with this 1b3 approach? It is obscure. Wouldn't be surprised if he's like, all right, let me take a second to make sure I don't get a bad middle game. The eval bar, as you can see, is 50-50 there, meaning this is a roughly equal position, a coin flip. Often what matters in these games is who gets the middle game they're comfortable with. Forget the evaluation. Who knows the plans? Who's more familiar with the tactics and the patterns? That's going to decide the game, and Magnus plays c4, our first aggressive pawn move in the center by white.
Yes, c4 to put pressure on d5, hoping that black moves that pawn to make that Fianchetto feel extra strong. But both players should have familiarity with b3 lines because Hikaru Nakamura, he just lost his match to Alireza Firouzja, but he's been so successful with that first move throughout his chess career. And Danny, knight c6, development by Hans. All four minor pieces are out for each side. We've had no trades thus far, so the position remains closed. And typically we would think that's Magnus's specialty. He loves playing these maneuvering games, but Hans seems unfazed.
These guys have brought the tension in their relationship to the board. The tension is building. They refuse to give way. No one wants to blink. Not a single piece has been traded, as you said. It's not very common you get a position like this. And on that note, the tension is finally broken. You can cut it with a knife. C takes d5. Maybe getting a rook to the c-file quickly is Magnus's plan, right? You've got a knight on c6 in front of the c-pawn, and indeed he does it. There's also a quick plan to highlight, either via rook c2 or the queen moving up. Sometimes white will try to go for a battery on the long diagonal in these positions. You guard the e-pawn, the queen comes to a1. There's tactics on the diagonal and pressure on the knight on c6. Little funky.
Definitely funky. And for black, you often want to put a rook on c8, but not so easy because this bishop can jump out to a new diagonal and hit that rook when it lands there. But Danny, you called it. Rook c2, queen a1 potentially in the near future.
It could be a bad sign for Magnus that I just called the entire plan. Rook c1, rook c2. That's probably not the level of chess he's looking for today, Danny Wrench style. But it is a common plan in the structure, jokes aside. The queen battery will be dangerous. And the fun thing about it next is that if that e2 pawn isn't targeted, Robert, the e rook can also come to c1. And so you have this almost like Sicilian-style structure for white, right? With the open c-file. And in fact, the knight gets out of the way so that black can avoid this battery that's coming and maybe play pawn to c6 or c5.
That's a really strong move. Retreating moves with the knight are especially difficult to find. Hans backs up to go forward to d7 next to reinforce this knight on f6. And then the queen will get active after that because it's no longer tending to that knight on the king side. So I really like the way that Hans has played thus far. And I think he should be building confidence because he's handled the opening stage of this first game very well.
Seems to be confident. Lean back in his chair a little bit. Giving Magnus something to think about here as Magnus uses a little bit of the extra time he had to decide where to go. Does he follow through with the battery plan, the queen coming to a1? Does he look to do something different now that Hans has relocated this knight, as you said, a very strong idea?
Preempted it. And for Hans, he's now catching up on the clock as Magnus continues to think, trying to come up with perhaps a new plan. But queen a1 was the idea. It just doesn't have great effect anymore. And for Magnus, I'm actually not really seeing it. He is very passive in his position. All of his pieces on his own first three ranks. That's typically not what we recommend in chess. And he's trying to let his pieces lead the way, but we do typically like having our pawns, because this pawn on d5, for example, I'll change the color to blue, it restricts the bishop on g2's axis. Instead, Danny, we see queen c1 inviting c6.
Queen c1 invites c6, and it's awkward because you wonder where's the queen going next. So what does Magnus have up his sleeve? The problem when you have less space, Robert, just to highlight, is white has every single piece that they started with, besides the pawn you traded, which means they're kind of wrestling each other for squares, right? You see the cramped position of the queen, the rook, the knight, the bishop. They're all in each other's way, And black actually has more space, especially if you do get at some point to play c5 or even c6, and you can start advancing because you have the furthest center pawn on d5.
That's right, and c5 comes with an added threat, I'll put that in air quotes, of a4, just trying to chisel at white's pawn structure and create some isolated pawns. So I think that Hans has done everything right, and now he's spending time, because Danny, there are some positions where you get tempted to lash out, and he has just done that. But rook takes c5 is not out of the question. I know you typically don't want to give up a rook for just a bishop and a pawn, but if you can control all the dark squares, that could be to white's benefit, and here goes Magnus.
Magnus sacrifices the exchange, and it cannot be underestimated how big this moment is here. One, is Magnus playing that because he felt this game getting away? And if this game gets away, you couldn't have scripted it better for Hans Niemann. Winning with black to start the match, we said the only real chance Hans Niemann has in this match is to take an early lead, put Magnus on his heels emotionally, mentally. So I know we're early, and I know that there's going to be plenty of drama and hype here. We don't need to add to it with the hyperbole, but this is a big game. Hans wins this game up the exchange, and who knows what we're in for.
Objectively, the exchange sacrifice was justified. Here, we see the bishop h3 move, but it probably came at the wrong moment. Rook b6 hits the queen. There's a pawn that was behind that queen, and this queen on a4 is dangerously close to getting trapped. It has to reroute to the center, queen to d4. But excuse me, is this pawn on b3? Can you just capture that one?
I think it's hanging. Now, Magnus will have the queen and bishop on the dark square battery for the rest of the game, and that is good old-fashioned family fun on the king side, so black has to worry about that. But again, it's an exchange and a pawn, and Magnus is in trouble here.
He is, because it's actually just an exchange. That pawn on b3 was won by Hans, so it's not enough material compensation for Magnus, not even close. And he does have that great queen and bishop lined up. Knight d2 kicks that rook back. That rook on b5, honestly, is a bit awkwardly placed. But if black gets queen b6, suddenly we see the queens leave the board, and that has to be to Hans' benefit.
Yeah, queen to b6 looks great. Magnus allows the queen trade. This is going to be super tough to hold. And Magnus doesn't even have a time advantage to go with it. Hans has plenty of time on the clock. This already looks like a game that could, if anybody around the world wasn't tuning into this match at this point, if Hans Niemann wins with black to set things in motion here in Paris on our second semifinal matchup this Friday, call everybody. Call your aunt, even the one who never answers, and you don't even know if she knows how to use the internet.
Well,
this is going to break it.
This bishop on d4 is about to just be the hero in white's position. Look at it cover the b2 square. It can't be attacked very easily. A knight's about to hop out to e3. Maybe we'll see the bishop give itself up for this knight and try to win that central pawn. And rooks need open files. The c file is open, but unfortunately it's unattainable. The bishop on h3 covers that square. Rook e8 does all of nothing because the knight wants to get on e3 anyway. And Danny, that was a terrible move. The rook is trapped.
Knight to d2, and the rook has no squares. Oh my gosh, and Hans Niemann takes a brilliantly played game as black here, potentially starting off in a way that you couldn't ask for better, and just absolutely blunders with the rook on b3.
And now it's simple. You take this rook. In fact, you don't have to right yet because that rook can't go anywhere. But even if you take back, I thought the rook can slide to c1. There are all sorts of back rank checkmates against this king because the bishop's on h7. So, Danny, I hear some fire trucks or an ambulance, but I don't think they're for Hans.
Well, you had the display poster downstairs a little bit ago. This is fine. No, this is not fine anymore. Hans Niemann was in a great spot. This is no longer fine. The chessboard, the proverbial room is on fire here, and f3 is a Magnus move. Just recognizing that rook has no squares, get my king a path to enter the endgame as soon as I need to. This is looking tough. What a turnaround that move was with b5.
Tragic. You're trying to advance what could be a passed pawn. Instead, you are limiting the retreat squares from your rook. And now that rook has been captured, this bishop can even slide back to b2. Instead, he goes rook to b1, giving up a3. Yeah, he can, at any moment, play a move like bishop c5.
He wants bishop c5. Yeah, the pawns are going nowhere. And look at that bishop on h7. It's not playing. That diagonal is like looking at a brick wall on d3. I'm trying to find the way. We talk about how is the position blunderable, and I'm not seeing the way that Magnus can blunder this position. There are no tactics. There are really no weaknesses. And with Hans' clock ticking down, I think that the storyline we thought we were going to get with Hans winning as black is not going to be the case.
Yeah, the advantage was never that big, to be clear. He did have an extra exchange. It was a sacrifice. But perhaps he can fight his way back in this one. Rook c1, hits that knight. Oh, there's this back rank checkmate problem. So I don't even know where you go here.
It's not even that the bishop isn't good, it's that the king is getting checkmated.
Oh.
He is threatening bishop takes d3. What a fun move, a creative resourceful trick by Hans Niemann, because if you take c7, bishop takes d3, you not only free the mate, but you might queen the b pawn. Okay, Magnus sees it, of course, and now he's headed in. Bishop c5 check will be all she wrote. There will be checkmate on e8 or not, because Hans Niemann resigns.